Hey everybody, Bob from RetroRGB here, and this is going to be a video that shows you the different RGB cable solutions for your consoles and explains a little bit about the differences between them and what some of the terminology means. This is a follow-up video to a very quick example I just posted that showed the differences between a fully shielded cable that was wired properly for that console versus a total piece of junk $6 cable I got off of eBay. So the short version was that you get a lot of interference off of the bad cable, and you get a lot of audio buzz, especially when there's white screens on. So I'm going to break down each solution for you guys and just kind of go over the differences between each and what to look for. And hopefully I'll be able to explain it so that everybody walks away understanding exactly what cable is best for their solution. So I guess I'll just start from the top and work my way down. In my opinion, if you can afford the extra money for the cables, the best solution is to get a fully shielded cable that gets sync from C-Sync, not Composite Video or Luma. But while this might surprise you, C-Sync is only a very small percentage of it, and in the case of fully shielded cables, have no bearing whatsoever on performance. The only reason that I say C-Sync should be better is just for compatibility, because while you might have a fully robust setup, you never know if you're going to have to plug your console directly into a processor or switch or something that requires C-Sync and won't accept anything else. So for compatibility reasons, when C-Sync is available, get it. But to be honest, the much more important factor is the fully shielded cable. So just to explain a bit, when I say fully shielded, I don't mean just the outside of the cable is shielded. I mean each of the individual conductors inside is shielded. And the reason for that is this big long cable is essentially an antenna. So when you have your video and your audio and your power signals all running along each other for this entire length of this cable, you know, every time it gets a little longer, there's more of a chance of signal coupling over to each. And that exactly is why you'll get those checkerboard patterns from Composite Video Sync or the audio buzz on other cables. So, in my opinion, step one would always be fully shielded C-Sync cables when possible. My second choice for RGB cables would be fully shielded ones that get sync from either Composite Video or Luma. And that really depends on your situation. So if it's in the case of a PAL N64, I would actually recommend Composite Video just because there are some issues with Luma on certain model PAL N64s. So I would recommend that. Also, if you're going to be going between a PAL SNES and a PAL N64, you might as well actually get Composite Video as sync anyway, just so you could use the same cable on both. But as long as the cables are fully shielded, as you can see here, there is no interference at all from the Composite Video line being in the same cable. Since it's actually got its own shielding on the inside, you don't have to worry about any of the checkerboarding patterns or any of that. And, you know, for PlayStation, it really depends. I don't think it would matter at all if you have a fully shielded cable, whether you would use Luma or Composite Video. And I guess I would just determine what other consoles you would use it on or anything like that. But overall, as long as it's shielded, it doesn't really matter, and it might be safe just to use Composite Video because every console with a multi-out has Composite Video running out of it. If you don't want to spend all the money on fully shielded cables, or if maybe you want to buy the fully shielded ones for your favorite consoles and then buy cheaper ones for maybe the consoles you don't play as often, then a good option would be to buy cables that sync on C-Sync or Luma just because there's less chance of interference. However, before I continue, I just got to remind everybody that not all cables are created equal. So I think the best way to demonstrate this is to show an example of a fully shielded cable that syncs on C-Sync and a fully unshielded cable that also syncs on C-Sync. And now we get to the explanation as to why I always recommend going to reputable cable resellers. The cables that I was just referring to as fully unshielded are really just found on eBay or just for cheap on those websites that just sell bulk of everything. They're basically just junk cables. Whereas the two main cable resellers, Retro Access and Retro Gaming Cables, all use at the very least partially shielded cables. So if you get one of their C-Sync cables, and even though it doesn't have full shielding on it, you're going to get way less audio interference, if not any at all, and no video interference whatsoever. So it's absolutely worth it to pay a few extra dollars to go for the reputable resellers rather than just pick up one junky one on eBay. One interesting thing to mention, Retro Access makes some composite video sync cables that I get absolutely zero interference from. I spoke to Rachel and she said the way she makes some of these is by actually separating the composite video line inside and moving that over. And that way you get no checkerboarding pattern and you actually also get very little to no audio interference. And these cables are the same price as her other cheap ones. She just decides to make them that way just to try to add a little bit of value to the composite video sync cables. So if you're using things like a PAL GameCube or like I was talking about before, the N64 or SNES from PAL regions, maybe this is a good option. I know that Rob from RetroGamingCables.uk was kind of going down the other path with it. Rather than try to make different models of cables, he was just trying to go and make all of his cables shielded, which, of course, being a nerd, that's my favorite option. But, you know, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. So, you know, I love that there's more than one option for this, and in my personal opinion, this is a perfectly good option for something like a PAL GameCube or even just a SNES if you're just looking for a composite video sync cable. Any analog cable that's in your setup will have an effect on your signal quality, so it's important to note that not only do you have to worry about console SCART cables, but any of the ones you use on the output side will also have an effect on your signal as well. So I just wanted to talk about the differences between some of the common ones you might see. Of course, you might find some cheap unshielded ones which will act exactly as if it was some of the unshielded cables from the consoles, but one of the ones you might find online pretty cheap is from Cable Direct. Now, these are big, thick cables, and they're cheap, so I actually think they're a great set of cable to have around just in case you need a spare, but they're not actually fully shielded. It's kind of deceiving because when you look at the inside of them, each of the lines actually has a separate ground wire running alongside it. And the cables themselves are separated, they're not all swooshed together inside of this. And while those are good things, it's not as good as having a cable where each individual line on the inside is shielded. Now, both major cable manufacturers, Retro Access and Retro Gaming Cables, have their own fully shielded SCART cables, and these have each individual line shielded just like their console cables. So this is really an important thing to have at the end of the chain because you don't want to spend all that money on really high quality cables just to have the last cable in line have some potential to add signal interference at all. And while I do like the Cable Direct ones, and for the price, I mean, you should probably just pick one up to have a spare cable laying around. The one that I actually use in all of my quality test videos, and even in my main setup in the office, are the fully shielded ones. And I believe they even make these SCART to JP21, so that might even be a help for other people's setups. One last thing to mention too is that any switch that you put in the chain will also affect quality. So exactly like the examples that I just shown of the composite video sync signal or the power next to the audio, if you have a switch that's poorly designed that runs those signals next to each other on the board itself, then you might actually get some of those interference problems as well. And that's why I tend to really promote things like the G-SCART switch that are designed with audio-video quality and retro gaming specifically in mind, so you don't run into those issues. Whereas cheap switches, you absolutely will see interference and see any of the issues that you might see in the previous examples I just showed. I'd like to talk about different cable options and even ways to modify existing cables, but before I do, I just want to do a very quick recap. So basically, anytime you have a cable where each line inside of it, as well as the outside, is fully shielded, it's your best bet because there's almost no chance of signal leaking between, and you could have a perfect analog signal with no interference. Anytime that you step down that line, you want to reduce the interference as much as possible by using C-Sync instead of composite video, or you could even do things like separate the audio to a different cable. But overall, that's basically the explanation. And if anybody really wants to see examples of this stuff in better form, I'll leave a link to the bitmaps of the blue sky in Super Mario, as well as the audio recordings, so you could really put on headphones and hear for yourself uncompressed, and really tell the difference between the different solutions. Okay, let's move on to some fun stuff. I have here a fully shielded cable from Retro Access that outputs to BNC connectors. So this way, if you want to go directly from your console right into your either Extron crosspoint switch or BVM or PVM monitor, you have a fully shielded solution to go directly in. Now you might be wondering why these cables are so long. I actually bought these specifically to test with an Extron crosspoint 32, which I'll put the picture up here. But the actual unit itself is so big that you need to spread these cables out very long. But it doesn't even matter if I use this on a BVM because each individual line here is shielded itself. So if I were to cut these open, you would have a conductor in the middle and shielding on the outsides. And also the audio cable is separated on the outside as well. So this is a perfectly fun example on how you could still have shielded cables and do things like go directly into a BVM, a PVM, or like in this scenario, an Extron crosspoint. Here's another example of an alternative cable that is fully shielded. Here are the HD Retrovision RGB 2 component cables. These suckers are absolutely awesome. The technology that went into this is very cool, and no, it's not an off-the-shelf RGB to component converter. There was a lot of research and development that went into these, and as you can see, these things are thick and heavy, and that's because each one of these individual lines is fully shielded on the inside and out, and then the entire cable itself is shielded. So these actually use composite video async to ensure compatibility across all SNES consoles, and you'll never see any video crosshatch interference because it's all shielded and they're all really well made. So that's just another example of a fully shielded cable that it really does its intended use and works perfect. Now on the completely opposite end of things, here is a totally unshielded solution that works perfect for its intended use. On one end, we have a SNES connector that gets sync from C-Sync and has the proper resistor in there. And on the other end, there's a D-sub connector, not VGA, it's just the connector, and it has the proper capacitors in it. So this thing actually outputs perfect quality video. Now, the audio runs through the cable and comes to this breakout, but at the time I was predominantly using the digital audio mod for a SNES and not analog, so this was really only used just for testing or when I wanted to make sure something else was working. But just as a video cable, this worked completely fine and I never had any issues. I used to run it through a VGA switch and I had no complaints. All the tests that I did showed no interference whatsoever, and I was really happy with it. Yes, there was an audio buzz, but I never really used the analog audio anyway, so I thought that was a perfect solution for it. But now let me show you another solution that kind of fits in the same vein. So here's that junky $6 eBay cable again, and in some scenarios, this might not be totally useless. So by popping open this end, you could actually move sync from composite video to C-Sync and have perfectly good video output on this thing. Now, you're still going to get a bad audio buzz, but like in the scenario I just described, if you're using a digital audio mod, or if you have any other audio mod done to your SNES, this might actually be a good solution, or at the very least, if you were looking to save some money right now, you could buy one of these, do this quick mod to it, and then use it until you save up to buy a real cable. And to be honest, having a spare cable laying around is never a bad thing in my opinion. So it's a worthy $6 if you just need to get yourself started. So let me show you how to do the mod. So I want to see what happens when I take this cheap cable that was $6 off of eBay that syncs on composite video and move it to syncing on C-Sync. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up the SCART head to make sure that everything looks correct. And They have what looks like the correct capacitors on there. They're probably cheap, but good enough. And because it's using composite video as sync, there's no components on this sync line. But I'm going to put that on the other side anyway. So I could just go right ahead and button this side back up. Make sure none of the wires pinch. Alright, so now we're just going to concentrate on the console end of things, which, to be honest, sometimes it's a real pain to get these things apart. So I'm going to start with a flathead bit that's really thin and just see if I could work this thing around. Now, I'm sure some of the experts might probably be laughing at me for this because there's probably another way to do it, but this one works for me. So you can see I'm just getting it in the space. There you go. So now I'm just going to look up which pins are which, and then I'm going to move composite video, which I believe is this one right here, over to C-Sync. Alright, so now I got all my stuff here. The first thing I need to do, though, is actually add a resistor to the line, because when getting C-Sync from the actual C-Sync output pin of a SNES, you need to add resistance. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because I have a whole other video on it, but I'll just say that I'm adding a resistor. I'm going to add some solder to the pin. It actually looked like some of the solder was touching the one of the other pins. Jeez, what a horrible cable. So that would actually be, I'm kind of curious what pin that was. So a little bit of solder from a ground pin was touching composite sync. Lovely. Just desoldered the composite video sync. I like to add heat shrink tubing. It's probably not necessary because the components won't really touch anything else, but you know, nothing wrong with it. Now I think I need some help holding this thing. Alright, so I'm going to try it as is, just to make sure it works, and then I'll button it back up as long as I did it right. Okay, so testing and working, so I'm just going to shrink that heat shrink tubing down. And then the only thing next is getting that cover back on. So it popped off pretty easily before. I'm going to want to use super glue. I don't want to put too much super glue because if I ever need to get this off again for whatever reason. So I'm going to take the notched part. There we go. So everything's nice in there, pretty safe. Add just a little, oh, yeah, I gooped the glue on the other side. Great, I'll have to clean that up in a minute. Well, now it's a what not to do with super glue. Okay, so that's in. Wipe off all the excess here. Oh good, that actually came right off. But now, just to make sure that this holds, it's a silly little trick, but I'm just going to add a zip tie to hold this in place. And this is just to help the glue dry. So I usually leave it overnight with a zip tie on it. You obviously don't need to leave this on. And if you don't, you don't have to worry about cleaning up unless you just let your glue goop out like I did by accident. But It actually doesn't need a lot of glue in order to hold. So that's it. So we just modified this for C-Sync. Well, that's pretty much it. Hopefully all these options weren't too crazy and overwhelming, and hopefully I was able to explain it enough so you guys at least understood where I was going with all this. But basically, if you want any more information on what sync is and what the different RGB lines are and different components needed in each cables, you could check out my site, and I'll also have other videos up as soon as I can, really going through the process and explaining everything that you would need. But one question I get all the time is, why do I need to buy expensive cables? And I really hope that this video did a decent job explaining that to you. So as always, I gotta have a huge thank you to my Patreons for supporting me. Without you guys, these videos would never happen. And as always, I want to hear comments and feedback down below. I read everybody's comments, even the crazy ones, and I always take your feedback to heart. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.